right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Danilo Aimini, and I wanted to spend some time to go over some of the systems we've been working on to aid the 3D extensibility. A little bit about me. So I'm a software engineer at AWS Game Engine and Developer Services. And over 3 years, I've been focusing on editor UX of what once was Lumberyard and is now Open3D Engine. But over time, I've also been working on other systems like the prefabs UX and the Python integration for editor testing and extensibility. In this session, I wanted to go over a few different topics, mostly starting from the concept of an editor action, and then understanding what the issue with modularity and all the challenges that modularity bring into this space of editor extensibility. From there, through a couple use cases, I wanted to just define the problem space and then how the new system that we've been working on wants to resolve those issues and actually provide a better system to extend the editor from gems and other plugins. So first of all, what's an editor action? So we can define an editor action as an abstract behavior that we can use to interact with the content of the editor in many ways. So one example could be duplicating an entity, centering the viewport on a specific entity in the scene, starting game mode, etc. These are all meant to be individual steps of one larger workflow. You could note that we have defined this as abstract, so actions can be invoked in many different ways. The bare bones definition of an action should not really take any of those into consideration. But then those are actually only the only way that the user can use to actually access the action. So any system that handles actions is also going to have to handle the way to access those actions. The elements are intrinsically connected. And so the systems handling this these actions are also going to be handling menus and toolbars and keyboard shortcuts and all of these elements. So why do we need a system or a new system at all? If you've ever used the Open3D engine and you've ever worked with its UI, you will know that we use a library as a foundation for our UI that's called the Qt library. And the Qt library already provides the implementation for pretty much all of these concepts. We have a Q action, Q toolbar, Q menu, etc. So we don't really need an implementation for the core concepts. What we need is a better way to organize and provide access to these actions from many different places. And the reasons why is going to be very clear pretty soon. So before going into the use cases, I wanted to go over the concept of extensibility for the 3D editor. One of the core tenets for the editor and the engine in general is modularity. We want to be able to provide a system and a core foundation for 3D development that works out of the gate, and then as a developer, you should be able to just plug in different elements at your own will. But from a UI perspective, that provides challenges in that all of those elements need to be defined in different places, in different repos, in different gems. And so all of that code is disjointed. But then from a UI perspective and a UX perspective, we want all of those different tools to actually be cohesive. And so if you were here in this very room right before me, you will have heard Lee talking extensively about this from a design perspective. So the BlueJ design system is how we are approaching this problem from the design standpoint. But all of these UX standards are going to be very useful from a developer standpoint in terms of knowing what to do, but are also very time-consuming to keep up with and keep on iterating and updating. So what we can do as editor developers is to try to make it easier and make it the path of least resistance to actually use a framework that already takes care of that aspect for you as a developer. And if any standard changes over time, you will know that using the base framework, you will inherit all of those changes automatically without having to keep all of these different places, like gems in different repos, up to date. So I will go over a few use cases that have been brought up in the past few months by different teams across AWS when working with your 3D editor. So the first use case would be adding a new item to a context menu. So in the main viewport for the 3D editor, you will know that by right-clicking, you will trigger a menu. And the use case was we would want to add a new menu item that will let you create a multiplayer entity. So by default, creating an entity will create an empty entity with just a transform component, this would provide a way of easily and quickly creating an entity with the transform component and a few more components that are going to be helping you with setting up a multiplayer environment. So there is a way of doing this in a gem extensible environment, which is extending the editor context menu bus. So a bus is pretty much just an interface where you can define a handler. And in this case, it is a notification bus. So it's going to trigger whenever the right click is triggered on the viewport. And then you will get a queue menu pointer to the menu that is being generated for that specific action. I will be showing a lot of code, but I'll be trying to just point at things as are relevant. In this case, a lot of the code is actually related to determining whether this action should or should not be created at all. Because in the case of your selection being on an entity that is supposed to be read-only, or other cases in which an entity cannot be found, this action is not displayed at all. And so all the code just goes out early. But then, when we have defined all of these, we create an action on demand and then add it to the queue menu at a certain position. The position would be determined by a separate function that's called getMenuPosition, and this determines when your handler is called. And so in this case, we've defined it's going to return the top position, and that is why our new menu item is at the top. So you may have already noticed a few issues with this implementation. So actions are always created and destroyed at runtime at the moment they are needed. And so that makes it hard to reuse this code, since all of those checks that we have done to determine whether the action is actually valid and should be there or not need to be replicated every time in every place that we want to add this menu item to. And also, this does not really scale, because, of course, again, any place will have to do the same, and also every menu would have a specific bus that needs to be implemented for that specific context menu, and that, of course, doesn't really scale at all. And then for this specific implementation, the problem is that it works in clusters. So I have defined my handler is called at the top. But what if I want to introduce a new menu item in between, for example, instantiate prefab and instantiate procedural prefab in this menu? Both of those items are defined by the same handler, and so that is impossible with this current implementation. So we are also missing some customization options in a way. Another use case that looks very similar is in the case of the AWS core gem, they wanted to have the ability to create an entire new menu and add it to the top bar of the main editor window. And yeah, it looks very similar, but the implementation is actually very different. To actually get this implemented, what they did was extend the editor events bus, which is a generic bus that doesn't really have anything to do with menus. It's just going to tell you, OK, the main window is ready. And then from there, you get access to that main window. And so through use of base queued code, it's going to scrape that window for the menu bar and then add the menu by detecting where the help menu is. So it's very involved in the queued backend, pretty much. So again, issues. This is hard to discover. If I were to think I want to add a menu here, I would not be thinking I need to find when the main window is enabled and then go from there and write my own queued code, which requires, of course, different knowledge. Of course, well, if you're developing tools for 3D, you're going to be required to know and learn some queued. But in this case, it's a very simple addition where we would want this to be abstracted as much as possible. And then in an environment where gems are dynamically loaded, there's a lot of possible in-syncing issues because we have no guarantee of which gem is loaded first and which gem is actually interacting with the menu first. And so there is no error handling aside from the one that is implemented by the specific developer. And so that is also very problematic. One quick last use case is, OK, so we do have these systems. They're not perfect, but they're there. So let's say I want to use them, but I want to create my own main window and inherit all that. So in the case, for example, of Script Canvas, we have a new main window with different functionality. Can I inherit any of this? Answer is no. By default, you don't get any of that. You would have to re-implement it from scratch for your window. And that is either missing functionality at worst, or at best, you could have an implementation that is similar to the ones that we have seen, but it could be slightly different, or it could change over time. And so, again, it's really hard to discover and keep up with all of this. So here's how, like, after going through all of these use cases over time, we've determined, OK, we would need a different way of doing things. We want a new system that actually handles all this and covers these use cases and has like a few tenets that were kind of inspired or collected through all of this use case detection. And so I'm going to go through a few tenets. They're not all the tenets for this system, because we are missing still some other functionality that I couldn't really cover because of time constraints. But these are the ones that are really relevant in terms of extensibility of the editor. So the first tenet would be, this system needs to be reusable. So we want to reduce the amount of boilerplate code that you have to write in multiple places, and it's exactly the same, so that it's encapsulated in the action itself instead of being wherever you need to trigger it. And also, it should be allowing you to reuse the action you have defined in multiple places. So if you want to add the same action to a context menu, the edit menu of the main window, and then a toolbar, you just define it once and put it in different places. And it's going to be using the same exact code underneath. The second tenet would be extensibility. So you should be able to do all this from gems and external code seamlessly, and have a correct handling of error and issues. So if for any reason some dependency breaks and a gem is missing that should be there, the system should still be working fine, the editor should not crash, and you as a developer should still be able to find error messages relevant to that when you're debugging. But it should not be disrupting user experience. And last but not least, the system needs to be contextual. So what we've seen with the last use case is that we want this to be replicated into different places and possibly keep the same API everywhere. And so it will be the user interactions that are going to determine which actions are available at any time, for example, from shortcuts or even in menus. So we proposed a new design for this system in May through an RFC, and development started right after. So this system and everything that I'm going to be describing in the rest of the presentation is actually already in O3DE in the development branch. Parts of it are actually in 22.10, but in both, it's behind a feature flag. So you're only going to be able to test it out and play around with it by enabling this feature. That's a settings registry file that you would have to create. So this new system keeps those tenets that I was going over in mind and has some core tenets, core concepts that I wanted to go over real quick. So first of all, we define the concept of an action context. So when we have a widget or a window, we should be able to define an action context. For example, I define a context for the whole main window, and that owns the actions that I attach to it. But then I should be able to also create contexts for specific tools, and that's to handle minor differences in actions between the different widgets in the editor. So for example, I can define a Control-D action, like a Control-D shortcut for an action that duplicates entities in the scene, but then selecting a component in the inspector and pressing Control-D should actually be attached to duplicating the component itself. This hierarchical context setup would allow you to define these actions separately and have, based on the focus, the editor just determining which one should be used. And of course, this should also apply to external tools. So again, in the case of Script Canvas, I can create a context for that window, and that should work in the same way. But of course, if I don't set it as a child of the main window, events should not propagate to it, since it's a completely different context. Another of the core concepts for the system is identifiers. So in defining all of these different objects, we want it to be possible to access them from many different places. And so we defined the idea of an identifier for actions or contexts or any other element. And in our case, they're going to be string identifiers. So as you can see, for example, this is a sample call for creating a context. We just need to get the interface and then define a few properties for it. In this case, it's just a name. And then the structure of a registration call is always pretty much the same. So the first element is the parent, and in this case, I'm just setting it to no parent. Then an identifier, properties, and whatever other object or argument is necessary for the registration call. In this case, it's a queue object pointer for the main window. The identifier is a string for some few different reasons. One of them would be making it usable from across different languages. So, for example, I could use this same API from Python and have it be completely exactly the same without having to marshal different types or different ID types. And also, we want it to be super readable whenever this is serialized to disk. And so when serializing a menu, for example, you have a list of all the menu items inside it. And that's going to be pretty straightforward to just edit, even manually. The string identifier should be unique per type, but it is not necessary that it follows this specific structure that we have here. So we have defined this structure as O3D dot whatever the object type is dot category dot specifier. It is not a requirement, but it's really helpful in avoiding collisions between different gems, because if you use the name of your gem as your category, unless somebody creates a gem with the same name, then there's not going to be any collision. And in that case, you have bigger problems. Next up, register an action. So registering an action is pretty much the same as a context in terms of the base structure of the API. So we have a properties object where you can define name, description, icons, etc. And then register action call to the action manager interface, parent, which would be the action context in this case, action identifier, properties, and then the behavior to attach to the action. Actions actually also have a concept of states. So you can install a state callback that determines whether the action is available or not in that exact moment. So I can say, OK, for this action, I set up a callback, and then I determine this action is always enabled. And so it returns true. This is quite useless, but that's just an example. And this callback is going to be triggered every time the action is updated. There's an update action trigger directly in the API. So if you're doing your own implementation, you can trigger it manually via the identifier. But again, to promote reusability, we also introduced a system that will let you add an action to an updater. And an updater is literally just a list, like a set of action identifiers. And the system that registers this updater is also taking care of triggering an update on all of those actions whenever the condition that it's defined for is triggered. So in this case, every time the entity selection for the editor is changed, then this action is going to be updated automatically. And so that also prevents you from having to rewrite and extend buses in your gem. If you have an updater that's already determined by the main editor, you can just reuse it pretty quickly. And then for menus, again, same structure and same API. There's a different interface for them compared to the actions. So the menu manager interface will let you register menus. There is no parent concept for menus, so you would just add the identifier and the properties, and that creates a menu for you. And then you can add actions to it. So adding an action is literally just a matter of determining which menu to add the action to, the identifier for the action, and a sort key, which is an integer that's just determining the absolute position of the action in the list. And this way, if I want to add the same action to multiple places, menus, toolbars, etc., I just have to trigger this call in another place, and it's a one-line affair. I can also get the current position of an action that's already in the menu by its identifier with this call, get sort key of action in menu. Last but not least, synchronization. Since all of these concepts that we're introducing are dependent on each other, so whenever I create an action, I need to know that the context that I want to add it to has already been registered. There's a set of hooks that are called whenever the system is initialized, and that can be used by gems to just make sure that whatever they need is already defined when they create something new. So I wanted to go over the use cases that we were going over before, to see how this new system would make it possible to address them in a more clear way. And so in the case of the first use case, adding to a context menu, we just need to know the identifier of the menu we want to add to. So for this specific context menu, it's going to be something like this. Of course, knowing where this identifier comes from right now is an affair. It's a matter of going to the code and pretty much seeing where it's defined. The intent over time is to actually make this accessible through the editor's UI itself. So you don't have to actually go and scavenge everything through the repo. And so to actually implement this, the code would be something along these lines. So in the multiplayer gems system component, on action registration hook, the gem would be able to just register this action once, set the hotkey, and then all of that code that was being triggered at the beginning of the previous implementation would go into the install enabled state callback. And so the action would be set as enabled or disabled. And there are settings in the properties to determine whether a disabled action should actually show as disabled in the menu or just be hidden. And so if those needs change from the design perspective, the default is going to change accordingly. And so you're going to be safe that it's going to follow all those standards. Then I add this action to the correct updater. So it's going to be triggered every time the selection has changed. And then on the menu binding hook, I can just add the action wherever I want. In this case, if I know the identifier for the create action, I can get the sort key for that and then just say, OK, add it a little after that. So I can take that value and say plus 50. And so I'm resolving the issue that we were having before, where I can actually add it in between menu items defined by the same system. In the case of adding to menu bar, the previous implementation was very different from the first use case. In this case, it's actually the same thing. We actually have a definition for a menu bar object, which is registered in a similar way. I'm just going to skim over it, but it's pretty straightforward once you see the API. And then there's a add menu to menu bar call that works exactly the same way. And so you can just say, OK, add this menu here. That's it. And in the case of creating your own tool, all of these setups can actually be used to register for external tools. So if I create my own main window in my gem, I can say, OK, this is my menu bar. I register it, and it's now accessible to all gems that depend on this. And same for context menus, for toolbars, et cetera. So this is bidirectional too. So I can create an action in my gem and then add it to a menu in the main editor window. So what's the status for this work? So all of this that we've been talking about has been already implemented and is part of the development branch of O3DE. But there's also additional functionality that for multiple reasons, mostly time, I could not go over. So you can define an action as checkable and display a property value as a check mark on it for a menu, or the background changes depending on whether it's enabled or disabled for toolbars. There's a definition for toolbars or toolbar areas, which I've not covered because of, again, it's very similar, so it didn't really make sense to split it up. Submenus, separators, so all other utilities to create menus that are more complex. And submenus can also be added to elements in toolbars. And also widgets. So it's possible to create and register a widget with a factory for that widget. And so it can be attached to multiple elements like menus and toolbars, and they appear everywhere at the same time because it's going to duplicate and create multiple copies of that widget. And then the intent is to have this also accessible from Python, both for testing purposes, but also to enable the creation of tools for the editor in Python. Not all the calls are available currently, mostly because of issues with marshalling Qt objects between Python and C++, which are going to need much more work. But the base idea is, like, it is possible right now to create an action in Python and then have it accessible in the editor. So what's ongoing right now? What we are still working on is actually making this enabled by default, as we were saying. So right now, it's just available behind the flag. What's stopping us is we would want to have at least the main editor window to adopt this new system everywhere before we actually make it enabled, because else it would really make no sense. And once we get there, we plan to just start migrating other tools and other gems to the new system so that everybody can just adopt it across the board. And then, of course, documentation and sample code are going to be extremely important for adoption. And so that's something that's actively being worked on. Future work. So this system right now wants to be accessible from so many different, all possible places, pretty much. So the intent would be to also make it instantiatable from standalone C++ tools. So, for example, the material editor would be enabled to just to just instantiate this and have the same functionality again. And the same would happen with Python tools down the line. And then user customization. It is not really about editor extensibility, but of course a big part of menu, toolbars, and hotkey systems is the ability for users to customize their workspace. And so that is also something that is going to be worked on as part of this effort. And that's it. So thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I am available. Yes, Mike is coming.
Wait, 1 second. If someone wanted to localize the editor, do the abstractions through the action manager help or hurt or affect in any way our ability to localize those menu names and the hotkeys that trigger them?
So they wouldn't really be affecting in any way compared to what we have right now. So right now, throughout the whole editor, whenever we have like labels or interface names, etc., we go through the Qt language translator like APIs, but we're not really using it to translate it down the line. We are using that same process, though, in the new tool. So right now, it wouldn't change much. Depending on the solution we go for, then, of course, we would need to implement it. But it's going to be like in either system, you would have had that same problem.
Thanks.
So at the end there, you kind of touched on the work to be done for user customizability. Would it be possible to implement not just like add to menu for like add to context menu for gems, but for the user to add custom items to the menu? Like, is it kind of possible in Blender with the quick menu, so that you can add something to your right-click menu, or maybe a different context menu so that it's easily accessible if you happen to use it a lot?
Yes, so that is part of that conversation that we were having with Lee over like a few months ago, which is so far we pretty much mostly support toolbar and hotkey customization, but we've seen a lot of tools introduce menu customization as well. For example, Blender or Visual Studio was another example we saw. And we would want to have a UI to do the same. So you could just like add a new menu item for your workspace in a specific menu, and then those changes can be serialized, and so you can just take your changes for your specific like machine you're using and port it to another machine seamlessly. Or if you add it to the project, it would just be shared among the whole project.